Are the Dead Sea Scrolls actually fakes? What about the James Ossuary that we've heard is also a fake? Well, it turns out our guest today, Dr. Craig Evans, who is a distinguished professor of Christian origins at Houston Christian University, says there's a bigger story that many people need to pay attention to. Craig, honored to have you on. When you and I first started talking about this at a number of weeks ago at a conference, you started sharing stuff, and I thought, how have I missed this? You got to come on my show and share this with my viewers. And in this show, you actually are going to break some news that I think is going to stir things up. So can't wait to get there. Thanks so much for coming on.
You're very welcome.
Well, you did mention the Dead Sea Scrolls, so let's jump ahead to that one. That's perhaps one of the biggest controversies of our day. And what you said to me is that there's some evidence that these fragments that were purchased by the Green family, of course, in the Museum of the Bible, universities like Azusa Pacific, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, might not be fake. Where's the data on this right now?
Oh, it's rather impressive. And what it's done, it's opened up a whole new item in inquiry. And so, Sean, your program will be the first to hear this. So
Okay.
I'll not only get you and your hearers updated on these fragments aren't fake after all, but are genuine. But it raises a whole new question about Jewish understanding of purity and why the leather scrolls were used in the first place, leather instead of presumably cheaper papyrus. So we're into something that it's going to be quite astonishing. It's going to generate a lot of conversation. And to the best of my knowledge, you were the first to hear this, the first to air it. So let me back up. These fragments, here's what created all the suspicion. A wealthy collector in Norway gave an interview 20 years ago, and he said, oh man, I'd give a lot of money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, even millions of dollars, to have fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And he actually named certain books, curiously, mostly from the Pentateuch, and plus the old Aramaic text. We'd found, I think, at least 20 fragmentary scrolls of Enoch in Aramaic. And so he mentioned Numbers and Deuteronomy and Enoch. And curiously, within a couple of years, on the market were fragments of the very books he mentioned. And of course, what a lot of people assumed was, poor recent doctoral students in Hebrew who hadn't found a job yet and had $100,000 of tuition debt loan to pay off, got busy with some authentic fragments of very old leather and wrote out brand new script, just a few words and lines, on fragments that in some cases were hardly bigger than a postage stamp, and started selling them to this collector in Norway and then to the very schools you mentioned, as well as the Museum of the Bible, the Green family, and everywhere else. And so people were immediately suspicious. Isn't that strange? This guy gives an interview, mentions certain scrolls that he'd love to buy, pay a lot of money to get them. And lo and behold, a couple of years later, a bunch of these fragments start showing up on the market. Now, I have to admit, I was suspicious too. So a former student of mine, who will go nameless, I did his MA with me when I was in British Columbia, Canada. And then he went on to do a PhD. He's a very fine student. Well, he had a research grant that took him to Norway, and he was privileged to see this collection. And he did something that apparently no one had done before. He started looking at these fragments very carefully under a microscope. And he got some other experts involved. And they said, boy, this really looks suspicious. And so without going into a lot of the scientific detail, what he noticed was the leather under the microscope was obviously old. It's 2,000 years old. But this is what was mysterious. Leather, as you probably know, if it gets really old, it dries out and it cracks. And if under a microscope, just imagine my fingers, the gaps between my fingers are the cracks. Well, he noticed that the ink would jump the cracks, the ink, that up the letters. So the leather was clearly old when the letters were added. And then he also noticed that there'd be, under the microscope, you could see it, imperfections, scrapes, abrasions, maybe bits of dirt, soil embedded into the letter, and the ink would go right over it. So it's like, wait a minute. And so the suspicion was, and this is the conclusion everybody jumped to, was the leather is authentic. It's 2,000 years old. But these fragments were blank, and only in recent years, say 20 years ago, after this interview was given, people started writing, and it's the Hebrew Bible, so it's no mystery as to what the text is. It'd be real easy to do it. So you take a little fragment, you place it right on the Hebrew Bible in a certain location, and now you know which letters and words to write over the fragment. Looks like an authentic piece of Deuteronomy or Numbers or whatever. So that was the theory. And so this was actually published in Dead Sea Discoveries. That's a respectable journal, Revue de Qumran. And so, oh my gosh, and I mean, people got fired. There's been lawsuits initiated.
Wow.
We want money back. I mean, it's getting to be quite a deal. And again, for legal reasons, I'm not going to name names. I'm not going to get into it.
Sure.
I have cautioned a few people. You might be suing somebody for selling you authentic fragments. So be careful.
Oh my goodness.
You could end up getting countersued. I mean, check it out. Now, here's what happened, Sean. I've been appointed to the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation board. I'm a board member of the Dead Sea Scrolls Foundation, and the chairman of the board is Weston Fields. He's been operating this thing for 30 years. Its basic function is to raise money for Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship.
Okay.
To get the DJD volumes, Discoveries of Judean Desert, get them published, get them out there, get all the scrolls published. Well, he knows the Kando family. That's how we refer to it. That's not really the last name, but Kando was his nickname. The guy who was buying fragments from the Shep, the Bedouin and Mark Samuel back in the day, Palestinian Christian man, way back. I met him in 1992. He died the following year in 93. So he's the guy. He knew, like Bill Brownlee, my doctoral supervisor, Bill Brownlee, John Trevor, they were there in Israel 47, 48 when the discoveries from the first cave came to light. So anyway, I'm discussing this. This was the number one business item at our meeting at the Society of Biblical Literature meeting just last November in Denver. And I said, let's get updated on these fragments. And he said, they're all right. These are authentic. They came from Kando's box of fragments that he keeps in Switzerland. There's no question they're authentic. And I said, yeah, but Weston, what about this evidence of the ink jumping the cracks, right? Going over pieces of dirt stuck on the leather and so on. And he told me, he said, all of the scrolls are that way.
Really?
I just, what? He says, yeah, my student. And the guy's working. He said they should have looked at the authentic, the unquestionably authentic scrolls. The ones that were originally found that everybody knew about, not the ones that mysteriously showed up decades later in somebody's saddlebags from his camel. They all have that. And so he says, there's no doubt in my mind, this is Weston Fields, he doesn't mind me quoting him, he's writing a history of the whole discovery of the scrolls and their publication. Volume 1's out, volumes 2 and 3 are in the press. And he says, all of the scrolls are that way. And here is, Sean, this is the interesting thing. We've always wondered why expensive leather scrolls instead of cheaper papyrus. And of course, we're talking about a library that at one time would have had way more than 1,000 books. We have about 900 fragments of 990 or whatever now. One cave completely washed out, so all of its contents ended up in Dead Sea. Molecules today, if you could find them. So we're talking about a library that probably had 1,200, 1,300, 1,400 writings at one time. And the vast majority of them, with very few exceptions, were written on leather. Why? And one of the theories is purity concerns. One of the concerns is that, well, Jewish cows, Jewish leather, handled properly, can be used for these sacred writings, copies of scripture and so on. Papyrus, imported from Egypt, no telling whose hands handled the papyrus, we don't want. So even though the leather is harder to make, harder to prepare, more expensive, and so that's one of the theories. By the way, the majority of these leather scrolls are from an extinct cow, an extinct bovine species. Some of them are made from goat. Some of them are made from the native ibex. But most of them, and I've seen the reports. There was a conference at Princeton in 1997, and we had all the DNA reports given to us at that time. These studies of the leather was so specialized and so sensitive. Human skin oil from the scribes handling the scrolls. We picked up the human DNA off the
That's
leather scroll.
amazing.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, here's now the new theory. This is brand new. The stuff I've told you up to
Okay.
now, a few people know. Now, everybody's going to hear this. We think that's why they used the leather. It was a purity issue. We all of these scrolls, when the leather was made, the leather was stored for a period of time. Quarantine, not used too soon. And this is why the leather, and of course, this is super dry, don't forget. This is the Dead Sea. You've been to Dead Sea, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I've been there. I've been there in the summertime. I was there in July. And I tell you, you were just drinking water and you never needed to use the restroom. Just keep drinking water. And it's just going out of you.
Right, right.
And that would dry out that leather so fast. And so if this leather was quarantined, some kind of ritual, some kind of purity thing before you could write sacred text on it, all of the leather would have an aged, cracked appearance. And because it's been handled and put in places and moved around, some of it would have dust or whatever embedded in it. And so all of these clues that my former student and others picked up on, legitimate, good observation using the microscope, that explains them. And so what we could be looking at without ever thinking about it before, that's why we need to look at all the scrolls under a microscope and ask ourselves, hey, is this some kind of purity thing? Because Sean, you know, ceramic cookware has to be broken because it becomes impure after coming in contact with certain types of oils and so on. Stone jars don't, which is why you have John 2, the 6 big stone jars for the purification custom of the Jews. Jesus turns the water into wine. So that's why you have a lot of chalk, you have a lot of stone and so on, because it doesn't become impure. Ceramic, oh my gosh, you got to break it. That's why anytime you find a Jewish village, you find tons and tons of broken ceramic. There are steps taken for leather as well.
Okay.
And this cohere with the leather being a certain age before anybody writes on it. And if it's in the Dead Sea region, which is super dry, this explains why the leather has a dried out, cracked appearance before the ink is applied. And so this whole controversy could be leading to a breakthrough about purification, understanding of the very leather on which they wrote, which is why they do choose leather, as we had surmised originally, and not papyrus imported from Egypt. So we could be stumbling into a whole new area of inquiry that nobody had ever thought about, thanks to this controversy over whether or not these fragments are fake. They aren't fake, they're genuine. So there you go.
Okay.
Isn't it an interesting world we live in?
It is amazing. I want to make sure I understand, because you've used words could and possibly and may, and at the end you made a pretty bold statement and said these are not a fake. Is this a working theory that other scholars are going to check? Or are you saying this is a done deal, we know they're not fake?
I would say it's a done deal. We know they're not fake. I'm saying, could and should with respect to why the leather was old before using it for writing. That's theory. I think it's plausible. It aligns with everything we know. It explains the data as we have it. But I pressed Weston, and of course the whole board was there. And he said there's no doubt in his mind. He said there might be 1 or 2 attempts at fakes where somebody kind of thought, hey, maybe I can, And of course there are fakes out there, not involving the scrolls, but the Gospel of Jesus' wife. I mean, it's authentic papyrus. It wasn't super old.
Okay, let me jump in before we get to the Gospel of Jesus' wife. A couple more questions on the Dead Sea Scrolls, just to make sure I understand. So these universities that we mentioned and the Museum of the Bible, are these all the scrolls that they have would be legitimate, or some of their larger would not be fakes?
I would say it's very likely, and I don't know which one or two possible fakes that Weston was
Okay.
talking. That's why I have to be a little cautious here. But I'd say in most cases, all of the fragments they have are genuine, and that'd be South.
Wow.
Their fragments are very likely genuine. They came out of Kando's box, a box that has
Wow.
contained since the 1960s.
Okay.
And Bible, their fragments are very likely genuine, all of them. Same with the Azusa Pacific. Yeah. Same with the Norwegian collector we've been talking about. Yeah.
Okay, so presumably they know this. I haven't seen any press on this. What are they waiting for? Why is this not coming out to kind of redeem themselves, so to speak? Because the assumption, as far as I've seen it, is that these were all fake and they were duped.
Yeah, I know, and that's where it's been left in the media. I suspect no one is going to um, jump up as I am right now because I don't
Hmm.
have any skin in the game. It's whatever, however it turns out. Houston Christian University has all kinds of artifacts. Um we're not in this mess. We don't have Dead Sea Scroll fragments. We don't have the Gospel of Judas. We don't have anything like that, or
Hmm.
Jesus's wife, anything like that. So we don't have a problem here. But my guess is that there's such a serious legal matter here now that people,
Oh.
several million dollars, at least four different parties, several million dollars in aggregate, buying things that they then had reason to believe were fake, are now talking about and perhaps engaged in lawsuits. Now the word is coming out they probably aren't fake at all. So my guess, and I'm the son of an attorney and the brother of an attorney, my guess is they're saying, look, these things, we have to get experts to look at them very carefully.
Hmm.
Weston Fields says, and Sean, I'm sure you know this, and your dad knows this, talking about New Testament papyri and other biblical documents, you have what you call comparanda. You have comparable items with which you make comparison. That's how you determine dates. So if I have an undated papyrus found in Egypt that is written in a certain hand, and I find another papyrus that is dated, it's the third year of the reign of Emperor, Caesar, somebody, and it's written in the same hand, I compare them. So that's what we mean
Right.
by comp. Then it helps me date it. So
Okay.
comp also determine authenticity. And so if Weston Fields says what he says, and they start looking at the War Scroll and the Hymn Scroll and scrolls that were found right away in the very first century before anybody would have even dreamed of trying to come up with fakes, and they know these are authentic, there's no question about it. These were actually found in situ by archaeologists and so on. To look at them, and lo and behold, the same phenomena are there, the cracked leather, the ink jumping the cracks, the ink going over dirt marks and abrasions and that kind of thing. Then I think what will happen is, from a scientific point of view, the conclusion will be reached: these fragments aren't fakes; they're just as authentic as these other things too. So that, I think, is where that'd be my guess.
I realize we're guessing here. Any sense of just an insight from how the world of archaeology works? I know these things take longer than we would like in our instant culture, but is this a matter of months? Could this take years and play itself out? What would be your best guess?
Well, from a scientific point of view, it shouldn't take more than a couple of months. You get permission to look at under a microscope. You don't have to look at the entire document, but just look at one sheet from the War Scroll, one sheet from the Hudayot, the Hymn Scroll, one sheet from this, that, and the other. Look at about, at a sample of 10 or 12 from Cave 1 and a few others from Cave 4. Just look at them, look at the leather under the microscope. This really isn't rocket science. It's just using a microscope and using some light imagery to get some certain color patterns and so on. So it's not that hard. And then look at these fragments and compare them. And if the phenomena, the stuff we're seeing, these cracks, the ink jumping cracks, etc., if what we're seeing looks the same, uh, then, and no one doubts the age of the leather. So no one's claiming the
Okay.
leather was made 20, 30 years ago. they're all agreeing it's very old leather, and they can't tell the leather from of the new fragments, the recently published fragments from the leather of the original fragments. So that's not the issue. It's
Mm.
when the ink is applied, and if the so-called evidence that says this ink was applied 20 years ago instead of 2,000 years ago, if the evidence indicates that it is in fact applied a long time ago, I think then that settles it. I think then, how can anybody say they're fakes? How can anybody say they're modern? And I think that ends it. And then legally, you got to settle it, got to figure out, apologize for suing somebody for the wrong reason, I guess. But see,
Wow.
that's the science.
Mm.
But when you get into the legal thing and the political thing, it's like this pandemic. Well, then the science might not be followed. Then it becomes a legal tug of war.
Mm.
It goes legal in its courts, and now we're talking a couple of years. So it could be a couple months. It could be a couple of years. I don't know.
Mm. I realize it's early and this is the first public announcement you've made about this, but are you aware of any critics and skeptics who have this data and just interpret it differently?
I've spoken to a handful of people. I spoke to some people at Southwestern out of personal concern because I know those people. And I'm not going to name any names, so I said, please slow down and talk to Weston Fields
Hmm.
because I hate for you, not just the embarrassment question, but you could be countersued. If it turned out that the brokers sold you in good faith fragments that turn out to be genuine and you're suing
Oh, gosh.
the fake and demanding money back, you could be incurring a lot of embarrassment, legal
Wow.
fees, countersuit. So I think this is a case where we just have to get the facts straight, have some good grace about it, and apologize and move on.
Hmm.
Uh, Now, Weston did tell me he was aware that there might have been one or two attempts to create a fake. He didn't tell me which texts they
Okay.
were, who has them, but he says the vast majority and possibly all of them are genuine.
That's crazy. I will be following this as close as I can, legally and scientifically, to see how it plays out. What an interesting story. Now, you hinted at this Gospel of Jesus' Wife fragment. I want to come back to that, but one of the other ones I know you've written on and talked about is this James Ossuary. It seems like it was legitimate and then it wasn't. This debate has gone back and forth. Remind those of us, because it's been a few years since it's been in the news, exactly what this discovery was claimed to be. And as far as your best understanding, where does the science seem to point right now?
Now, I'm totally on top of this, totally current. I will caution your audience Wikipedia is not current.
Hmm.
Wikipedia has a clear bias often when it comes to these kind of things. The ossuary was first observed, it was purchased in the 70s, and I've seen eyeballs, my own eyes, on more than 1,000 ossuaries in person. I actually was privileged
Wow.
to walk through the Beth Shemesh IAA, the Israel Antiquities Authority storage facility at Beth Shemesh. It's about 15 miles or so southwest of Jerusalem. Personally in it, looked at probably, I don't know, 950 ossuaries. I've been to the St. Anne's collection. I've seen their 100 ossuaries. I've been in other collections and I've seen maybe 11 or 1,200 ossuaries firsthand. I've photographed dozens,
Hmm.
certain inscriptions, great interest. I've got my nose within 2 inches, magnifying glass, looked at inscriptions, that kind of thing. And the James ossuary is a mystery right away because it's weathered. Ossuaries may be broken, they may be vandalized, but they're never weathered. And the reason for that is they're inside. They're inside a tomb. They're in a cave or whatever. They're not exposed to elements. Water might drip on them. They might be stained. Sometimes a rock collapses from the ceiling and drops down and hits an ossuary and breaks it. Or a tomb robber carelessly pulls the lid off, it falls to the floor and breaks. They tip over the ossuary, trying to spill out the contents. They don't care about the skeletal remains that pour out onto the floor. The remains get trampled into dust. The thief is looking for coins and jewelry and other artifacts that can be easily carried out and sold. Sometimes the ossuary itself is carried out. These things are heavy. They have a thickness about like that, a thickness of 1.5 inches, sometimes 2 inches. They're carved out of a single piece of limestone. They are very heavy. And you can't stand up inside these tombs. You have to be bent over. You and I Sean, would be considered giants 2,000 years ago. Most men were 5'4", 5'5", and even they couldn't stand up straight inside. And you trying to carry an ossuary that weighs 100 pounds or 80 pounds and crawl out through narrow passages with it would be almost impossible. So they're broken, they're looted, emptied, and that typically happens. And of course, we're talking about tombs that are 2,000 or more years old. So when you find a tomb that has not been violated, it's wonderful. But the ossuaries are always, it's like they were carved yesterday. And ossuaries that I'm permitted to touch, I would run my hand. It was as smooth as a baby's backside. And you'd get a little bit of that dust on your hand from the chalk. It's a type of chalk stone, limestone. That's not the James Ossuary. The James Ossuary is pitted. It's a rough surface, and the inscription is deeply etched. The inscription, why it's a sensation. It says, Yaakov, Jacob or James, Ba Yosef, son of Joseph, Achwid Yeshua, Achwid, brother of Jesus. So James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. So this ossuary has not been inside a cave or a tomb. It has been exposed to the elements. I have seen ossuaries used as planter boxes.
Wow.
This ossuary has been exposed to the elements for decades, maybe 100 years. Looted from a tomb, who knows where. Somewhere in the vicinity of Jerusalem, maybe near the Mount of Olives, as is speculated by some. I don't know. There was soil in the ossuary because it was used as a planter box. At the bottom of the ossuary, embedded in debris, were bone chips from 2,000 years ago. Can you believe it? One of the bone chips is large, probably from a femur. Still has the possibility of some bone marrow and DNA. So who knows? This story is far from over. So anyway, a collector, Oded Golan, who owns it, he bought it, he says, in the early 1970s. In his trial that took place 30 years later, he was able to prove that because there's a photograph of all things taken by an ex-girlfriend. It's not often an ex-girlfriend gets your bacon out of the fire. But there his ossuary is on a shelf like a bookend with albums and books, including the Tel Aviv phone directory. Some of your audience would know what a phone directory is, but back in the and they're leaning against this ossuary, and you can clearly see the inscription in the picture and the date on the phone directory, which is, I think, if I remember, 1974.
Okay.
Plus the record albums. So there's no question this guy owned this thing since the early 70s. He doesn't know anything about the Bible. He's in antiquities, but it never occurred to him the meaning of these names. And so it's in his living room. Now get that. He clearly is not ultra-Orthodox. He has a bone box in his house. And then later in his collection room, and then later still in storage. And that's where André Lemaire, a French epigrapher and Old Testament scholar, sees it. He visits this guy. Anybody with collections says, have you added anything lately? And he takes photos. Can I publish this? And he's looking for inscription. He says, I think, yeah, let me show you my scrapbook. And he looked through the scrapbook, and here's the picture of it. He says, oh my gosh, this. Oh, it's in storage. So he finds it in storage, and there it is, that infamous picture that James Ossuary is sitting on a toilet.
Yeah. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And he reads it. He says to Oded, do you realize what this says? It says, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. And Oded says, so? These are
Oh my
common names.
goodness.
Jacob, James, Joseph, Yeshua. So what? He says, this could be the Holy Family. He goes, what? You mean Jesus had a brother?
Oh my goodness.
He did. Oh. So that's April of 2002. So Andre gets a hold of the late Herschel Shanks, who published the Biblical Archaeology Review. Herschel went out and visited. Herschel always went to Israel too in the summers, sniffing around for stories for his magazine. Oh my gosh, they can't believe it. So I'll skip all the other details. It was announced in October of 2002 that it was found. Immediately there were naysayers who were all
Sure.
totally, the Aramaic, it can't be authentic Aramaic. They didn't know what they were talking about. They were all wrong. And then at the November meeting of the Society of Biblical Literature in Toronto, and we were all there, I was there, we were all there looking at it under glass in the Royal Ontario Museum. Now, what you need to know is when they shipped it to the Royal Ontario Museum, it had cracks, natural cracks in it, and they wrapped it up so tight in bubble wrap, it imploded and broke into 6 pieces. So they very carefully glued it back together, did a great job. And that gave them a chance to look under the microscope at the broken edges. And they said, there's no question this is authentic. And I'm talking about the inscription. Because some were saying, oh, the inscription's been tampered with. Oh, the inscription, somebody added words. It used to not say brother of Jesus. Somebody added that at the end. And Ed Keel, who was the head of the Royal Ontario Museum back in the day, 20 years ago now, he said, no. He said, it hasn't been tampered with. That inscription's authentic. It's just as old as the box itself. It's 2,000 years old. And according to Josephus, James was murdered in 62 AD, which means 1 year later his remains are gathered up, put in this ossuary. So this ossuary dates to the year 63. It's pretty unusual to be able to date a bone box that precisely. So then there's a lawsuit because people came forward saying, oh, that word has been added. Oh, it's... And then that infamous story came out in 2003 calling it the James Bond, some kind of bonding agent with calcium, chalk, dust mixed up, added to it to create a phony patina. Well, here's what's interesting. I'm not going to name his name because, who knows where this is going to go. But under oath in the Supreme Court, this is about a decade ago, he acknowledged he's the one that created this phony bond as a test. He acknowledged authentic patina in all 5 words. Jacob, Bar, Yosef, Akwi, Yeshua. All 5 Aramaic words, 3 of them are names, all 5 have traces of authentic patina, which you cannot fake. Most of the patina had been scraped away because Oded Golan had retraced the inscription to make it easier to read, and he thus gouged out much of the authentic patina. Patina is a combination of, it's like sweat as the lime dries, the dust that clings to it, a little bit of mold that grows, and this creates a patina, as we like to say. Old paintings turn yellow, that kind of thing. And that's what it is. And he had scraped out most of it, but some of it was still there, traces in all 5 words. So that's why today there's no question, it is authentic and it's a done deal. It's settled. Wow. There's nothing you can talk about. The only people that don't know that are Wikipedia and the people that read Wikipedia.
Oh my goodness. So somewhat in summary, if I was going to be a skeptic on this, I'd say found in some guy's house, doesn't know what he has. The chain of custody has so been lost of where this thing has been for 2,000 years. But you're saying the dating and all the other signs of it go right back 2,000 years old. And so it really can't be explained another way because they obviously weren't faking ossuary boxes in that era. So if we're right that it has the names specifically Jesus, brother, or James, brother of Jesus, and the son of Joseph, there's really no other explanation that can account for it.
Yeah, and you know we've done math, and here's a book I can show you. This is by Tal Ilan. You'll notice the name of it, Lexicon of Jewish Names.
Mm,
So she recorded every single name we have from antiquity, Jewish name, found in archaeology or mentioned in literature, the Bible, wherever. And so we can speak as far as that goes about statistics. And so there's a 1 in 4 chance because you know there are so many men named
got it.
Jacobs, so many men named and so on. But see what makes this so interesting and why it's 1 in 4 chance and not 1 in 400 is because it isn't just 3 names at random. It's a relationship. And so you have a man named James who is the son of Joseph and he's a brother of Jesus.
Yep.
So that creates specific relationship. But here's the other thing, Sean, that's I find compelling. There's only one other ossuary we know of the 3 or 4 thousand ossuaries, whatever the total number is that's out there. They're not all published. There's only one other ossuary where you have so and so, son of somebody, brother of somebody. That's only one other.
Got it.
And so the assumption is the brother is better known than the deceased or his father. Well, does that apply to this box? It certainly does. Jesus would be the one who's super known. And so it's James, who's fairly well known, son of Joseph, who's probably not that well known, brother of Jesus, who is very well known. So the box could be interpreted that way. And then if that's true, then it is the box of the well-known 3 men of the New Testament. But as statistics go, it's, there could be another 3 or 4 other combinations of the same relationship back in the day.
It's interesting he's referred to as the brother of Jesus because Josephus, of course, does the same thing when he refers to James and the death of James as the brother of Jesus in Antiquities. So that's a very interesting overlap. Now, you said Wikipedia doesn't accept this. Is the larger scholarly community, even not evangelicals, on board with the confidence in which you hold about the James Ossuary?
My sense is that it's not that interested and agnostic.
Oh, okay.
I have talked about it. I in my Jesus and the Remains of His Day, 2015, I update everybody on that and talk about the actual official scientific report and the retraction that the chemist made who had originally thought that it was fake. I mean, there was some malice going on there.
Wow.
He's in serious legal trouble. I don't want to mention his name or get into any
Sure.
more detail. Oded Golan is suing people.
Wow.
There's a fellow that was won a significant settlement. His name was dragged through the mud. Also, he was quite innocent. There's the hostility sometimes that erupts in the antiquities world is shocking. So anyway, I've not ever had any pushback. So if I talk about, say, you are aware that the science in fact confirms that all 5 words are authentic, all 5 words have traces of the original patina. Really? Oh, okay, I didn't know that. Nobody pushes back. I'm not aware of anyone publishing anything, trying to push back. Wikipedia has no excuse for being uninformed because that was a legal decision made in the Israel Supreme Court. And it's based on scientific reports, including chemists in Germany who weighed in and testified. And all of this has been gathered up and published by Herschel Shanks about 9 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that. I have a report.
I'm obviously not an archaeologist, but I follow these stories, and it's amazing as you're highlighting how much money, reputation, legal battles, all of these are underlying this science. So it's not just this objective search for information. There's a lot at stake behind the scenes that is often missed in these stories. Well, let's look at one more, and then I'm going to have just a few questions for you about how you recognize a real from a fake, and maybe if there's some other discoveries that are still being played out in front of us, is what you called the Gospel of Jesus's Wife, and it's a Coptic fragment. What's going on with that?
Oh, man. Oh, I know, I know. I know a lot of the people involved, and it's
Hmm.
embarrassing. Um, the fragment, I'm backing up a little bit and sharing with you stuff I didn't know at the time because it was announced in September of 2012. That's when all of us heard about it. But now I can back up a little bit. A year and a half before that, or almost 2 years, a German American named Walter Fritz, living in Florida, contacted um, Karen King at Harvard, who
Hmm.
is known for Gnosticism and Coptic, and contacted her and um, said that he had found a fragment. He himself had studied Coptic in Berlin years earlier, so he knew a little bit of Coptic. He knew a little bit about it, and this had come into his hands. And but he couldn't read the text and thought she might want to see it, and sent the text to her. And she actually couldn't read it. And
Hmm.
what should have worried her right away, she's looking at a text she can't quite figure out. After saying he can't read Coptic, he has to read it to her, and he discovers that in it Jesus is talking to disciples, and some of them don't know why this woman has to be here. And then her name is given, it's Mary, and then he says, "Well, my wife," and it, of course, intriguingly breaks off at that point. And by the way, the fragment is about. I'll hold it near my face so you get a little bit of a
Okay.
perspective about the size of it.
Hmm.
Okay, not very large, and it just has 7 or so lines, something like that. Not one line is a complete sentence. And so it's on papyrus, and the papyrus looked authentic. And so she then, Karen wrote a paper. She finally became persuaded it probably is genuine. Maybe I should write something on it. She went to a conference in Rome, and it was revealed in 2012. Reporters were there. And of course, she always tried to be helpful about it. She put online her paper. I have it. The version that she read, not and I have the version she
Okay.
later. And here's a picture of it in color. It's a very high resolution, beautiful picture. And in my book, Jesus, the manuscripts, I have it in there. Harvard gave me permission to use it in my book so I could talk about it. I really appreciate that. They're very
Hmm.
courteous. And so everybody was just stunned. They thought, well, how can you call this the gospel of Jesus' wife? You don't know if it was a gospel. You have no idea what the literary genre is, for one thing. There isn't one complete sentence, so we don't really know what the gist of the conversation is. Has there been any scientific testing, whatever, of it? And all she could say is, "Well, I gave it to Roger Bagnall, who's a well-known and respected papyrologist and classic scholar at Princeton or Columbia, I guess is where he is." Anyway, so Roger said, "Yeah, it's authentic papyrus." Well, it's just like the leather for these scroll fragments we were talking about a few minutes ago. The papyrus might be authentic, but when did the ink get put on it? Well, I've looked at in person, I've had in front of me probably 1,000 papyri.
Hmm.
Some of them I've literally held. It's unusual to be
Wow.
allowed to hold a papyrus in your hands. Most of the papyri I've looked at are in Greek, some Latin, but mostly Greek. But I have looked at up close, inches away, my eyeballs, at Coptic papyri. I have studied Coptic. And there was something about this that didn't ring true the first time I looked at
Hmm.
it. And then I started hearing from colleagues who, were familiar with Coptic also. They all said the same thing. It doesn't look genuine. Or as Herschel Shanks might have said, it doesn't pass the smell test. And so, and here's what it was: the writing didn't look right. Somebody was using a brush, not a stylus or a quill, and not a very good, skillful brush.
Hmm.
Too many. It almost looked like a paintbrush that a kid used in kindergarten. And the ink was too shiny and glossy. And that's what really put me off. When you've seen 1,000 papyri and the ink is dried out, brittle, dusty, rusty, flaky, and then you see something that looks like it's jet black gloss, and you can almost see your reflection in it. It's like, so of course the media went nuts, and I was phoned by reporters. One of them asked, "What do you think about it?" I said, "I think it's a fake. I don't think it's as old as my grandson."
Wow.
After I hung up, I thought that I probably shouldn't have said that. because my grandson in 2004. And so, man, that would mean this papyrus isn't even, or this text isn't even 8 years old. Well, you know what? I was right. Oh, whew,
Wow. Wow.
close. Well, anyway, we think it actually was composed in 2007, 6 or 7, shortly after the movie version of Da Vinci Code, and that was the inspiration
Mm.
of Da Vinci
Oh,
Code.
very interesting.
And now it's determined the papyrus itself isn't really old enough. It's 8th century. This dialect of Coptic had died out 200 years before that. Well, then gratuitously, oh, well, maybe they just kept making copies of copies, that kind of thing. And the other problem was they didn't use brushes for hundreds of years prior to that. So it's
Mm.
the wrong tool. The papyrus isn't old enough. And then the killer of killers. There's snippets, words, and phrases all taken out of the Gospel of Thomas, the Coptic version of Thomas. The only one surviving Coptic copy that survives that was put in a tomb, which means it wasn't publicly available for a long time for anyone to
Mm.
use. And so whoever copied it after it was published in 1948. And here's the other thing, Sean. Somebody had taken the Coptic Thomas and put it online with English underneath as an interlinear and made a couple of mistakes. And guess what? The mistakes carried over into the Coptic papyrus.
Oh, interesting.
So post 1948
Mm.
mistakes that are in the text. And we all alerted Professor King, there are
Mm.
problems here. Karen, don't publish this. So she did new tests, decided, no, there's nothing wrong with it. And instead of publishing it in 2013, they published it in Harvard Theological Review in 2014. And then everything just exploded. In 2015, the New Testament Studies did about 5 articles on it, showing it is definitely the faker has been identified.
Wow.
His place of residence, his shop, turns out they're full of these kind of facsimiles and fake. I'm not going to say anymore because some of it's X-rated, what this guy
Wow.
was involved.
Wow.
And so Karen and the dean at Harvard Divinity School have conceded that it is a fake and that
Mm.
Karen was, I feel bad. She's a nice person, a good scholar.
Mm.
I feel bad that she was like this. This
Sure.
character was, it was just a money grab. He was just riding the Da Vinci Code bandwagon and all that nonsense about Jesus and Mary Magdalene.
All right, so last question. There's this deep fakes that we hear about with like video where you can put somebody's face on it and barely tell, at least from kind of the naked eye, so to speak, whether it's true or not. The technology is just getting better and better. I assume that's true in archaeology, that if this story was a decade ago and a brilliant scholar like King was faked by this and there was some debate about it, is that technology getting better and better? And how do we know and decipher something that's real from a fake?
Well, that the good news is that same technology helps us detect fakes.
Mm.
It is true. I'm not trying to brag about my ability with Hebrew or anything, but if I had a piece of leather that was authentic and it was 2,000 years old and had been scored, so they have these little creases, I would know, I could myself, I'd practice for several days. I could take and had the authentic ink, so it wouldn't give it away. I wouldn't use a Bic pen, but authentic ink. I could hang my Hebrew letters from the lines, because Hebrew hangs, Latin and Greek rest on the lines. Hebrew hangs.
Mm-hmm.
Write out a fragment, pack it in salt, age it. After about 6 months, carefully brush away the salt, look under a microscope to make sure I didn't leave any kernels of salt, grains of salt. And I could sell it. I could fake somebody out.
Mm.
So it was hard. However, the technology is so sophisticated now. Remember the Hitler diaries? The Hitler back in the 1980s, mid 80s, they were extremely well. It was more than 60 volumes, supposedly written out in the 30s and 40s, and fooled everybody. 3 or 4 handwriting experts said, yep, that's Hitler's handwriting.
Wow.
Historians were all fooled. there were a handful of funny little anachronisms, and Time purchased it's like for $2 million or $3 million.
Wow.
And finally, somebody did the scientific test and said, wait a minute, the sizing that's used on the paper so that it's like an ink blotter when the ink is applied, it's made from a chemical that's post World War II. Well, Hitler was dead. He wasn't in the 1950s writing any more diaries. And it was exposed. And then the forger came forward and acknowledged, written it. See? So technology can, and there are fakes from antiquity. There are fakes from hundreds of years ago. And then it's only later. There was a fake Gospel of Mark that somebody carefully wrote out. A good copy in about 120 years ago. And it's in, by the way, I could hold up my Greek New Testament. It's one of the manuscripts listed in the authorities, but it was only exposed as a fake 10 years ago.
Unbelievable. That's really helpful to say that the fake technology is increasing, but the ability to recognize it is also increasing as well. So it seems like we're going to continue to have this drama, fakes, and identifying it forever. It's not going anywhere, is it?
No, and also, Sean, sometimes there's a knee-jerk reaction, like the temple rededication, the temple repair, Yehoash tablet that was found. I mean, there were 430 truckloads of debris hauled off of the Temple Mount and dumped. And the Wach people wouldn't allow archaeologists to be there, which I thought was extremely discourteous. And so most of this debris has been picked up and hauled to another location where it's being wet sifted. Well, it's likely looters found the temple there. And of course, you know what I'm talking about. This is more than 20 years ago. And Jehoash is the Judean king. Joash is the way we say it in English. Dedicating repairs done to the temple. And it dates to around 800 BC. So we're talking about the first temple. Well, people, it's a fake. Are you kidding me? You've got beautifully executed Paleo-Hebrew on this tablet. It's been scorched by fire, and it's been embedded with microscopic sized globules of gold that goes back to the first temple period. Now, who's the expert who did that? Who's the faker who did that 25 years ago? Sean, if you find him, let me know. I will hire him to teach ancient Hebrew here at Houston Christian University, because that would be the smartest guy in the world, whoever did that.
That's amazing. I know it's not the same, but my son, he's a shoe reseller. He buys these shoes, and he has this knack of identifying fake Jordans. Like, he'll show me, I can't see it. He's like, Dad, the weight. Look at the sewing. Look at the color. Look at the tag. And it's like there's intuitive sense where he now can just identify it because he's been doing it for a while. Regardless of the technology, it sounds like because you've held so many fragments, you've done this for so long, there's just a certain intuitive sense that cannot be captured in technology, that although some experts can be fooled, that pause that you have often should be paid attention to, because that's a sign that it's a fake, isn't it?
It is. And when I saw the fragment, Jesus, the Gospel of Jesus' wife, I looked at that, said that thing, well, like I said, it's not as old as my grandson. And when I said that, my grandson was 8, and it turned out the fragment was only about 6 or 7 years old. So I was right. But sometimes it's the opposite. A scholar looks at it, there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with it, but they want to be skeptical. The Mesha stone, or also known as the Moabite stone, it had been found, it had been broken up intentionally by the finders. It got glued back together, and people were saying, wow, this is really neat. And somebody said, oh, that's phony, that paleo script. Well, they were saying that because they'd never seen paleo script. And now nobody doubts the authenticity of the Moabite stone. And nobody should doubt the James Ossuary. Nobody should doubt the temple tablet, because you're talking about, an extraordinary care that somebody has done. And nobody was around to get money. There was
Mm.
no Fritz trying to sell it to Harvard. It gets found and it's picked up, and there it is. And then you get these, well, uh, that great inscription found in the early 90s at Tel Dan that says House of David. And so you get these dogmatic minimalists who say, or mythicists, there was never a King David. Well, this kind of embarrasses them.
Mm.
So here's a Syrian inscription at the border between Israel in the north and Syria back in the day, back in the 9th century BC. And in the inscription, it's talking about where the boundary ought to be, and hey, we're real tough, we beat you in a war. And then it refers to the House of David. Well, why are they referring to a mythical Robin Hood character?
Mm.
Why would they? And so, and of course, the knee jerk reaction was, oh, somebody faked it. Well, I'll tell you, it's right up there with the other one. You find out who that faker is, I want to hire him. That guy's good.
That's awesome. I love it. Craig, I have so many more questions for you, but I definitely want to respect your time. This has been fun. This has been illuminating, fascinating. I do want to say I just got the 2-volume set that Colin Brown started and you finished that I just want to commend to our viewers on the quest for the historical Jesus. It's a history of it. I'm going to work through both of these massive volumes. I've never seen a text like this. So for those who want to study the historical Jesus, dive in the story behind that. Maybe we'll come back to that and do that in another episode in the future. But love what you're doing at Houston Christian University. I had a chance to speak there, as you know. Consider you and your team partners with us at Biola, training as many people as we can in apologetics. So if you watch this, go study at Houston Christian University or think about coming and studying with me at Biola. We now have a fully distanced program. Information is below. Would love to partner in training with you in that regard. Craig, hang on so I can say goodbye, but really appreciate you coming on and giving us such fascinating insights.
You're very welcome.